Terrific, lovely. Okay, 2 boarding passes in there for you as well
I had to double check though, I am definitely glad.
Excellent. Yeah, you can show.
Yes, go for it.
Straight in that first dog, they're really good. Smart, it's great to have you on board. Your seat's just down here today. Charlie, straight down that first dog.
See ya.
Take care, bye-bye.
See you guys. Thank you. Locked and loaded, mate.
Locked and loaded.
Full taxi checklist, anti-ice, auto, recall.
Checked.
Checked. Flight controls.
Checked.
Ground equipment.
It is clear.
Full taxi checklist complete. Qantas 1330 received Romeo request taxi. Taxi hold short golf, Qantas 1330.
Clear on the left.
Clear right.
I'll have a quick chat to the passengers once we get over the other side of the runway, and so I'll hand over to you, Wang, once we get going over there.
Continue on to Lima, hold short 34 left, Qantas 1330. Okay,
Okay,
so
on to Lima, hold short. Off runway.
126, decimal 5, Qantas 1330.
Copy that.
Sydney Grand, good morning, Qantas 1330. We'll be holding on Lima, short of 34.
Hold short.
Before takeoff checklist, cabin report received. Before takeoff checklist complete.
Checklist complete.
Heading 335, line up and wait 34, Qantas 13.
Okay, line up, stop bars out, and one landing.
Clear right. 34 left, clear for takeoff, Qantas 13.
Take confirmed. Tap cruise confirmed.
Thrust set.
So this is a plan of action for our viewing today. The weather indicates that we should get good viewing of Cape Adare, though there's a little bit of cloud, and we're going to head to Cape Adare and then across to Mount Minto, and again a little bit of cloud forecast for that area, but we are guaranteed of good viewing along the north coast going west. So once we leave the mountains, we're going to head along the north coast in the direction of the Rennick Glacier, the Freiberg Mountains, and a little bit further west. So from the Rennick Glacier, we're hoping to head down towards Mount Serpentine, Mount Murchison, even as far as Mount Melbourne if we can, and see which mountains we can see down there. That'll be our turnaround point to come north again, hopefully to the Tucker Glacier, and then on to back to Mount Minto, and then that'll be time to leave Antarctica and head home.
But they're uninhabited. One of them's been climbed. The unclimbed ground level on Sturge Island, which has not been climbed. So they're extremely isolated places, uninhabited, hardly ever visited. They're named after Captain John Malcolm, who, together with Thomas Freeman, saw the islands when they were whaling down here in the summer of 1839. So, quite a time ago. It's interesting that Freeman's set foot on one of the islands, and that was the first landing of anyone south of the Antarctic Circle that we know of.
To make a phone call to one of the Antarctic bases. In fact, it's Casey. Whereabouts are you and how long have you been there?
For a month-long station across the summer. We've had a winter thing here. Which is, I don't know, our little mini version of running cold operators and weather forecasters and you know.
Hi, I'm Greg Fitzgerald, one of your commentators today on the flight deck with fellow commentator Peter Hicks. Welcome to Antarctica, the White Continent, the highest, the driest, the coldest, the windiest and the cloudiest continent on Earth. In for some great viewing today. Let's go and see what we can see. So folks, right on cue, the cloud has started to clear, so welcome to Antarctica. You're seeing good sea ice left and right now as the cloud dissipates, and ahead of the aircraft I can see the Transantarctic Mountains, and as I speak the pilots are just commencing their descent into Antarctica.
So the sea ice beneath us, it's got a lot of leads in it, so it's quite easy to see. Quite often sea ice is covered in snow and you can't really see any features or any discernment of water and sea ice, but there's a lot of leads, a lot of broken, cracked sea ice. So it is the beginning of the time when sea ice is vulnerable. From November through to March, the big blowout occurs. So this is temporary ice. It's formed over the winter. So it starts forming in March every year, and then quite quickly in various places, depending upon the temperature and depending upon the wind speed, the ice forms a quite thin and oily surface with spicules of small spicules of ice. That the freezing process also excludes salt, so the salt water drops out, and then the temperature becomes cold enough in the water for the ice to grow from the bottom up. And then of course you get snow that falls on top of that, and so you can end up with a metre and a half of sea ice. This sea ice would be about a metre, maybe half a metre thick, and you can see that it's taken quite a beating from some wind. So as winds, you know, the very, very famous katabatic winds that come down off the continental ice sheet, come down off the mountains, they slam into the top of the sea ice, and they literally break it up and blow it out. So this ice is in contrast to what we call fast ice. When glaciers reach the sea level, the momentum and the volume of ice that's coming down them, that's flowing from the glaciers above, spreads out, and it spreads out into ice sheets and ice tongues, and they are permanent. We call them permanent because they're there year round. They don't get blown out. They move extremely slowly, matters of metres a year, like 5-6 metres a year is a very fast glacier. Usually it's 1 or 2 metres a year. But this sea ice is something that ships have to get through every year. They have to break through it. That's why we have icebreakers supplying and coming into the bases. It can be an indication of what the weather has been like over the last month. You know, you can sometimes discern this amount of breaking means there's been a good blow sometime. So we can see now a layer of cloud pretty close to the ground, and below that broken sea ice, which gives that multi-mottled look to the ice ahead of us, directly around where we are now. Hi folks, Peter Hicks again. So there's a couple of nice little glaciers coming down here. When I say little glaciers, they're enormous glaciers, but these are not the really big ones. But I was just wanting you to have a look at there's a little rise that shows the junction between the glacial ice and the sea ice, which is always a point of contention, a sort of a place where the ice breaks up, and because the glacial flow, which has got moraine lines in it, which you can see here, is pressing against will put pressure on the sea ice and push it out. And that's why you can also see little bits of fast ice stuck in the last sort of freezing of the sea ice. At the base of the glaciers, you'll see little bits of debris that have come off the glacier in times when there was more water, or when there was less sea ice. So that's the source of these small islands of glacial ice that sit like they're on their own off in the sea ice. The sea ice is pretty firm. Sometimes that could be a function of the fact that this is not a particular windy place, although some places are very unpredictable. You can't tell how windy it's going to be. But you can tell the glacial ice because of the breaking up of it into pressure crevasses just here on the right hand side. If you see that, look at the ice stream coming down, you'll see little fields of pressure crevasses. If you're travelling at this time of year, it's a really difficult choice because it's so much easier to travel on the sea ice because it's flat. But it can be a desperate decision because any minute if the sea ice decides to get blown out, you're isolated. And of course, inland, you've got to deal with the crevasses in the glacial flows. So it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, and neither of them are particularly great for travelling.
So folks, we're as promised back in the clear, back along the coast, and now we're going to work our way along the north coast going westward. Quite interesting history along this part of the coast and some explorers that most of you wouldn't have heard of, and probably the most famous one that first came down here was an American by the name of Charles Wilkes. And Wilkes led an American expedition in 1840, so basically a year before James Ross came down the Ross Sea. And not to be outdone by anybody else, the Americans do things in a big way. It's bigger in Texas, and most expeditions had one, maybe two ships. Well, James Wilkes led 5 ships down here: the Vincennes, the Peacock, the Porpoise, the Relief, the Seagull and the Flying Fish. And he was a interesting character insofar as he was court-martialed twice in his career, mainly for atrocities against Fijians. But he also, during the American Civil War, he intercepted a British ship, a mail ship, and took off that ship 2 Confederate diplomats, which were on their way to Britain to negotiate with Britain. And based on that, the US and the UK nearly went to war. So he was an interesting character, but despite all that, he actually kept his command and he led an expedition down here. And he did a great job. He mapped 1,500 kilometres of coastline along this coast. And he never received the accolades he deserved. And the main reason because that happened was that he was too honest, and he released his initial charts to James Ross. And when Ross came down here a year later, he found a few faults in it, as initial charts quite often will have, and the British government led a campaign to muddy Charles Wilkes' name, so that the British could take, and James Ross could take, most of the glory. So that's Charles Wilkes. We're actually over Oates Land right at the moment, and we move very soon into Wilkes Land, which is the largest land in Antarctica.
So we're flying across those smallish glaciers on the coast here. This is the region in Oates Land where Leonid Gretskaya was. It was a Russian base where they studied glaciology and a fair bit of biology as well at Leonid Gretskaya, but it closed in 1991. But many of you will get a good view of the small crevasse fields that happen just as the glaciers get to the coast. These are tension crevasse fields where the ice is deformed, so it's literally where the river of ice is pushed up over a bump or a rock at the coast, and you see a little pile of, you know, what look like tears in the surface of the snow, and they're typical crevasse fields, very difficult to cross if you find yourself crossing a glacier. These are the kind of glaciers that Belgrade Ninnis fell down with Mawson, the famous trip of Mawson's, where he had to come back alone, where there was Mawson, Ninnis and Mertz, and it was these kinds of glaciers and this kind of coastal terrain that they were travelling across when Ninnis was lost down a crevasse. Extremely dangerous, extremely difficult country to traverse. Of course, it also depends on the recent snow, because the glacier that's on our right, or at least the coastal area where there's a big crevasse field, you know, with a good fall of snow, most of those crevasses will be covered in. You won't be able to see them, and then they're that many times more dangerous. And there's a great little patch of crevasses just in this glacier, right in the main stream of the glacier, and over the next ridge. There's a kind of a really sort of rough patch of crevassing in a little tributary glacier here. So just thinking about a few things about the sea ice and about ice in general. You know, when Greg welcomed you down here, he was saying welcome to the white continent, and there's more scientifically to that statement than meets the eye. One of the things about the whiteness of snow and ice is that it reflects infrared radiation back out into space. Albedo is the reflectivity of the ice, and for climatologists it's a very important thing, including the extent of the sea ice. So if the sea ice in a normal season grows, the actual size, the area of the Antarctic continent, both the ice sheet and the sea ice combined, is enormous. You know, the average distance from the coast on the Ross Sea side is something like 600 kilometres. On the other side of the continent, which is the Rhone ice shelf, the average is about 200 to 400 in a normal year. But this extent of the sea ice, that is how far out to sea off the coast the sea ice extends, has been diminishing, and in 2022 it was the smallest it's ever been, through the records been taken back to the 1940s. And then in 2023 it came back up again, and people were heartened by that, because it meant that, you know, there's a variation in the warmth and the amount of sea ice that can form in any one year. So they were relieved about that. But then this year, 2024, it's gone back to almost as small, the extent of the sea ice off the coast, as it was in 2023. So it's gone back down again. And why does that matter? Well, it matters in the amount of energy that gets reflected back into space determines how much heat is absorbed by the oceans and the atmosphere. So if the Antarctic sea ice doesn't form at all, a huge amount of heat during the summer goes into the water rather than being reflected. So the reflection of the whiteness of the snow and ice in Antarctica sort of feeds into a loop that can increase the warming, increase the amount of melting that there is around the coast, and therefore increase the speed of the ice flows and increase the output basically of ice and snow from the continent itself. As we fly along here, we're on the coast, so there's a lot of mountains, but sooner we'll be able to see part of the actual continental ice sheet. It's very flat, and it'll be off to the left of the aircraft as we fly to the west along the coast. And that ice sheet rises up to 3,000 metres and more. The ice sheet itself is 3.5 kilometres thick, sometimes 4 kilometres thick. And up on Dome C, there are 3 domes on the Antarctic ice sheet. They're called Dome Argus, Dome Bravo and Dome C, A, B and C. And they have different depths, obviously, depths of ice, and consequently they reach back in time to different ages. And at the moment, Australian glaciologists are involved in drilling a 1 million year core, which is a core that will have samples of the atmosphere, the bubbles in the ice, from 1 million years ago. So that's the project that's going on right at the moment up on Dome C. The other thing on Dome C is a Russian base called Vostok, which used to be one of the most isolated and the place where the coldest temperature on Earth was recorded. They recorded -80 there once. Now -80 is very close to the melting point, or at least the liquefaction point of oxygen. And so quite often people have said at Vostok they used to see plumes of blue air, which is oxygen becoming liquid in that very, very freezing cold air. Quite disturbing.
So folks, we have moved out of the Transantarctic Mountains now, and I should have mentioned that the Transantarctic Mountains flow right through Antarctica and come out on the South American side of Antarctica, and they go under Drake's Passage into Argentina and Chile and become the Andes. It's the same mountain group in actual fact. So right at the moment we've moved into another mountain group called the Freiberg Mountains, which not quite as high but very spectacular, and the Freibergs are left and right of the aircraft right at the moment. And these mountains were first explored by New Zealand expedition in 1963 and 1964, and they were named after Lord Bernard Freiberg, who was the head of the New Zealand Geographical Survey expedition at the time. But right at the moment, just on the edge, and we're just turning left, we've just moved over off the edge of the Freiberg Mountains over one of the largest glaciers in Antarctica, and certainly in this part of Antarctica. We've moved over the Rennick Glacier. Now we're flying straight inland up the Rennick Glacier now as we make this slight left-hand turn. Freiberg Mountains out to the right, and the other the mountains out to, I say the Freiberg's out to the left, and the Usurp mountains out to the right. And the Usurp stands for United States Antarctic Research Program. The Rennick Glacier, as I said, is a huge glacier. We're going to do some orbits over the Rennick. It is such a large glacier, but it's 320 kilometres long. So it's a huge glacier, and it's around about 40 to 50 kilometres wide. So you can really see how the Rennick has gouged its way down from the plateau that Peter was just talking about, and he just wants to say something. I'll hand over to him.
But one of the great things that I've just noticed now in the bed of the glacier, which is 50 kilometres across, is there's lots of examples where you can actually see blue ice, which means that the snow is blown off the surface of the glacier, and that's on the right hand side. But we'll be coming back. we're into some tributary glaciers here, and there's a beautiful little conic peak ahead of the aircraft, and some lovely smaller peaks all around. But you'll be able to see how steep the sides of these mountains are from whether they can hold the snow. The steeper they are, the darker they are. The rock gets exposed because the wind blows the snow off, or it falls off if it's really steep. You also get these patches of what look like somebody's torn away icing, or dripped a straw or something, or a teaspoon into the icing and pulled it down. That's crevasses and avalanches forming from the snow. The snow builds up to a certain point, but it can't hold itself up on the ridge, then it falls down and forms these kind of crevasse fields right up on the tips and on the sides of the mountains. But as we go back to the Rennick, you'll see patches of blue, very light coloured, lighter than the sky, but a light coloured blue, which is the classic glacial blue ice, the stuff that when you put it in your whiskey, the bubbles pop and crackle because it contains trapped air from when it was compressed up on the ice sheet. Glacial ice is much harder than sea ice as well. Sea ice is fairly crusty, and it's got salt in it at the base, a lot of salt in the base, and it's always got a sort of a mushy crystalline feel to it. Whereas glacial ice is like the ice you get out of the freezer. It's solid, it's slippery, and it's in the case of true glacial ice, it's blue. And the blueness is from the structure of the ice crystals and the way that they absorb some red light. It's nothing in the ice. It's very pure water, but it's as the ice is formed under compression, it forms a sort of slightly different crystal structure to ice, for example, that you freeze at 1 atmosphere. This is ice that's been formed under pressure and then brought to the surface, and it's when you shine light through it, or when you look at it, it looks blue. This is a great example of how the snowfall accumulates. Depending on the temperature and the weather and the wind, you can get meters of snow. When I was on the ice sheet itself, we had a couple of weeks where we had continuous snowfalls of talcum powder like snow, and we were trying to drive tractors along it. It was extremely soft, but we would get covered in 2 or 3, 4 meters in a couple of days of this incredibly soft talcum powder snow, and that then just gradually compresses. And here you can just look out and you see that there's been a fair bit of snowfall recently, but it kind of covers up all of the mountains except for the little bits of crevassing that you can see. But it also indicates that the source of the snow, because a lot of people can't believe the source of the ice. A lot of people can't believe that where does all the ice in the glaciers come from, and where does it go? Well, it comes from the ice shelf. It comes from higher altitudes. It comes down the glacial valleys, and then it gets deposited into the sea at the mouths of the glaciers, or it spreads out to form an ice shelf. Something like the Ross Ice Shelf is completely permanent, but the surface of it can be quite soft, as Scott's party found out, and it's hundreds of meters of compressed ice underneath that. So yes, on the right you'll get a good view of what are called lateral moraine lines. They're on the edges of the glacier. They're on the edges of the flow lines, and it's basically where the sides of the ice are slowed down, and it's where they accumulate pebbles and rocks underneath the side of the ice. It's got moraine in it, and as the summer progresses, you'll see more exposed rock in those lines that travel away to the right here. You can see all kinds of flow lines in the in this little section of the glacier, but there's a fair bit of snow, so a couple of patches of crevasse, tension crevasses. And how fast are these glaciers moving? Somewhere here, where we're fairly close to the mouth, it might be as much as 3 and 4 metres a year. I know that sounds incredibly small, but that's quite fast for a glacier. Mind you, they can get up to 7 and 8 metres and faster. But in the Lambert Glacier, for example, and a few of the other big glaciers that have steeper tributaries, much more pressure on the ice coming in. But typically the smaller glaciers on the side, the ice is only moving, up to a metre and a half a year.
So, just as Captain Sean was making that announcement, we've just continued flying towards Rennick Bay up the glacier, and we're just crossing the coast right at the moment as we roll the wings level here. Out on the right-hand side of the aircraft, you're going to see a large island in the middle of the bay, and that's Znamensky Island. Obviously, just by Znamensky, it's been named by the Russians, and the Russians have quite a large presence in this part of Antarctica. Obviously, Peter mentioned the base of Leningradskaya, which is just nothing left of anymore, which is about 100 kilometres straight ahead of us now. But you can actually now see the coastal delineation as we move out into Rennick Bay. So we're just going to work the mountains around the coastline here, and then by that time it's actually going to be very close to when we'll be swapping seats in just short of half an hour or so, and then we'll work our way back down the coastline, revisiting the Rennick Glacier, etc. Absolute look down on the left-hand side at the moment. You can see where the the Rennick Glacier is meeting the sea, and large icebergs carving off into Rennick Bay, I should say.
And sometimes you can see red lava in the crater. Well, how does this volcanism gel with the surface? And they ablate, in other words, they evaporate. The ice evaporates. So that's where scientists went, and that's where people go in order to find. 1939. So quite a time ago. It's interesting that the big blowout occurs off the mountains. They slam into the top of the sea ice.
A number of attempts before. You can see it through the mist. It's worth.
And ice tongues, and they are permanent. We call them permanent because they're there, which gives that multi-model. Back to the coast, just so that we've got a little bit more to look at.
The crust of the earth to be elastic, but in remove the pressure, the tennis ball returns to the group, and what they've got in common. We are just manoeuvring a little bit. You can see the blue ice. Folks, what we're actually looking for is any remnants of Leningradskaya. Now, I have not seen any for 10 years, and then really all that was left of it was some oil slicks in the ice. It really has gone. it is right on the escarpment, just underneath us at the moment, and we've just been looking out to see whether we could see any remnants of it, but it really was dismantled. And early on, the bases, especially some of the Russian bases, were not very environmentally friendly, and in this being such an early base, unfortunately what they used to do to get rid of their used oil drums was just push them down the escarpment. These days, of course, everything has changed, and every country that's a signatory to the Antarctic Treaty is very, very environmentally friendly. Nothing is left in Antarctica, everything is taken out. So the days of leaving oil drums here have well and truly gone. So we are just manoeuvring a little bit. You can see the blue ice on the right hand side. Look back towards the escarpment, and that's actually where the base was. We are not far, like 100 kilometres, from the furthest easterly point that Sir Douglas reached with Nimitz and Mertz in 1911, before the lead sled, which had Nimitz on it, went down a 150-foot crevasse, and on that sled was all the dog food, most of the human food, the main tent, and the 6 best dogs were pulling that sled. So Mertz and Mawson were in a lot of trouble. They'd lost Nimitz, and they made a decision to turn back. They basically had about a month's worth of food for something that they thought could take up to 4 months to get back. They started killing the dogs, not that the dogs had much meat on them, and they then started eating the best parts of the dog. The best parts of the dog was the liver. Unknown to them at that stage was the liver was extraordinarily high in vitamin D, and their skin started falling off, they started going blind, and they started to get violently ill, which ultimately led to the death of Mertz as well. So folks, whilst we're just going to continue manoeuvring and start working our way back down the coast, I'm going to sign off for the next 10 or 15 minutes with Peter as we do the seat change. So we'll come back to you in about 10 or 15 minutes.
And I just thought I'd tell you a little bit about my travels in 1980. So we went on 3 what we call traverses. One of them was for 107 days. That was the spring traverse, where we went out in the dark in winter. We left in about August and came back in sort of three months later, 107 days later. There were 6 of us, and we were in 3 caravans that were pulled by D4 Caterpillar bulldozers. So there was a scientific van with a carrot with a fiberglass caravan that was designed by RMIT in Melbourne, and we lived in that. That had a marine radar on the top of it, which we could see the lines of cans, aluminium cans that we put on Indian canes that we drilled the hole and put the cane in the snow with the aluminium can on the top, and that could be read by the marine radar. And we spent the time making measurements and checking the electrics and the programming the satellite receivers, and we do that for about a day, and then we'd travel another 50 kilometres. And yes, we had troubles with crevasse fields up on the continental ice. Yes, we took all our own food with us, and we cooked our own food. We saw some amazing aurora. We basically had a pretty good traverse. We got on quite well. Didn't always happen that traversers got on really well, but we did. We had a national mapping surveyor who was our navigator. There was me, who was the glaciologist and science program coordinator. There were 2 diesel mechanics, a radio operator, and that was about it. One of the things that we did before we left in the autumn in 1980 was that the surveyor and the doctor, the Casey-based doctor, and I, we were young and we were energetic, and we wanted to recreate what people did in the old days, in the heroic age. So we put together a man-hauling sled, and we wanted to go from Casey Base to a place called Browning Peninsula, which is along the coast about 15 kilometres. And we headed out across the sea ice and up onto the escarpment. And as we were standing up there thinking whether we should go across the sea ice or whether we should go further up into the mountains to go around and across the glaciers, I stepped forward and I fell into a crevasse. Now, this is not a huge crevasse like, obviously, that Ninnis fell into, not a continental ice sheet crevasse, but a coastal crevasse just near the sea. And what happened was a big chunk of the surface fell in with me on top of it. So a chunk of the surface, snow and ice, about the size of a Volkswagen, fell into the crevasse with me following it down. And eventually that chunk of ice, which was about the size of a small car, wedged into the walls of the crevasse eventually, and I fell into the wedge, fell into the snow. So I'm standing there with both my boots sort of planted about half a metre, my mucklucks about half a metre into the snow. On the way down I'd cut my chin and lip, so I had a bit of a cut. But apart from that, I luckily had man-hauling gear on and a pack. And the pack had some ventiles and a beanie, a balaclava, and my camera. So I was able to take some pictures from the inside the crevasse, which were all blue, beautiful blue and black looking down. And looking up, I could see several things. I could see the hole that I'd come through, and I could also see a cane lying about 2 metres from the top, lying on its side. And that cane had been put there to indicate that the crevasse was there, but it had fallen in to the crevasse and was now lying down in the snow, sticking out inside the crevasse. So my companions radioed the base, and the base sent out a Caterpillar tractor which had a winch on it, and I was able to get hold of a rope that they threw down to me and tie it around my waist. They tied that to the winch and they winched me out. So I'd fallen about 80 feet, quite a long way, and all I had was a cut on my chin basically. And I was very grateful to survive that, and we all went back to the base and decided we didn't really want to go to Browning Peninsula after all. Although Browning Peninsula is well known on the coast as a menagerie. There's lots of sea elephants there, snow petrels, Adelie penguins, king penguins, all kinds of animals. So it's a wonderful place. And I never got back there. But that was the story of me falling into a crevasse.
So folks, the cloud is building up a little bit too much and we don't want to waste time, so we're not going to get to Murchison. It is clouding over, but just coming up the left hand side is one of the highest peaks in this part of the Transantarctics, and that's Mount Supinol, and that's 3,600 metres high, or just on 12,000 feet. Yeah, so as we roll wings level now, in close at Mount Supinol on the left hand side. So folks, now we're left Mount Supinol. We're just heading back towards the north coast and back towards Mount Minto and Cape Adare, etc. The cloud on the right hand side will clear very shortly. We can see out the front of the aircraft, and hopefully we're going to get some good views of a very famous glacier just up here called the Tucker Glacier, which was named after Charles Tucker, who was a lieutenant on the Erebus with Ross. It's quite a large glacier, not as large as the Rennick. It was great to see the Rennick Glacier today in actual fact. So we're really over the Transantarctics proper now, and this cloud is just about to break up in a few minutes. It's got good views out to the left still.
Yes. The Tucker Glacier, it's one of the finest examples of what they call in Europe the Piedmont glaciers. There's masses of tributary ice and snow. You can see there's lots of avalanche falls on the walls. They're very steep, especially on the other side where we're sort of coming down. We're on the right hand side of the glacier right now, and you can see a lot of these avalanche falls where it's just got too steep to hold the snow. So it's not really crevassing, it's just falls of loose snow on the steep slopes. And then we come down to the glacier itself, and even though there's a little bit of cloud, you can see the lateral moraines, you can see some big crevasse fields in the actual bed of the glacier. Some of those crevasses would be, 800 metres, kilometre down. Big crevasses. And now on the right you can see, tributary glaciers coming in, and soon when we turn around back to the left, you'll be able to see the outfall, the whole opening out of the Tucker Glacier, which probably in the middle of the outfall it's going 6, maybe 7 metres, 8 metres a year. And this is a consequence of the fact that the feeding height of the snow that's coming down, the ice that's coming down, all of these glaciers come from about 3,000 metres, and they're going just over to the left of the aircraft is the Ross Sea. They're going down to sea level. So it's in terms of glaciers, this is a happening place. So really some fantastic, absolutely amazing sites of the tributary glaciers here coming down into the Tucker Glacier. Very steep-sided tributary glaciers. You can see the crevassing at the top. There's a thing called a Bergeschund, which is a German word for a big crack in the ice that's at the top, at the source of the glacier. Yeah, lots of great examples of steep slope, crevassing and avalanche. Yep. From the flight deck we can see a little bit of the Ross Sea over there. Cape Adare somewhere over there as well. When you look on those maps that you have, you can see that Cape Adare is a real toothpick. It's a very distinct geographic feature. And it's also, for this part of the world, all the way down to Mount Erebus and the Ross Sea, it's the starting off point, it's the kicking off point. It's where everybody comes.
So folks, the plan of action, Mount Sabine on the left-hand side right now, in close. That's quite close to us at the moment, and just to repeat, that's 3,700 metres high. What we're just very close by is Mount Minto. Now, Mount Minto is the second highest peak in all of Antarctica, with them, and it's very close to the coast. So Mount Minto is actually, as I said, named after the Earl of Minto, but we're actually in the Transantarctic Mountains, but this is actually the Admiralty Range of those mountains, named after by James Ross, after the Admiralty. There were many attempts to climb Minto, and the first successful attempt to climb Minto was actually by an Australian group, and it was part of the 1988 bicentennial expedition, and that expedition was led by Greg Mortimer, and Greg Mortimer is better known as being the owner of Aurora Expeditions these days, but a great mountaineer and a great explorer of Australia. And he led an expedition of 6, including himself, of Lincoln Hall, Jonathan Chester, Lyle Cross, Glenn Singleman and Chris Hilton. And they landed near Cape Hallett and they came up to Mount Minto, 130 kilometres, using a series of glaciers to get here. So I'll just read just a little bit from Greg Mortimer's diary. And he says, "We landed in the Antarctic at Cape Hallett on the 1st of February 1988. From there our route was up the Edisto Inlet to Football Saddle and hence to the Tucker Glacier. We ascended this to the Man of War Glacier and to the base of Minto. We left the coast with one motor toboggan." They actually had 2, but never mind. But we lost this at the edge of the Edisto Inlet. So I'll just add a little bit there because there is a book on this. They actually sent the toboggans back to the ship to get some more stores, and they parked the toboggans on the edge of the sea ice and had to walk out to the ship. And when they came back, the 2 toboggans had broken through the sea ice and were sitting on the sea floor. So that's why they didn't have the toboggans, but he didn't actually diarise that too much more. That's actually in the book, which is called The Loneliest Mountain, which is actually written by Lincoln Hall. Anyway, I progressed with his diary. From then we man-hauled all our equipment and supplies the remaining 130 kilometres to Mount Minto. I should point out that they manhandled their supply is 130 kilometres. McMurdo Station, which Scott and Shackleton etc. did to the South Pole, is 1,600 kilometres, just to give you some size. From base camp at 7,000 feet to the head of the Man o' War Glacier, we took a day to cross a small pass and head to the Ironside Glacier. After a day of storm, we climbed the South Ridge from 10,000 feet to the summit, with a temperature of minus 50 degrees Celsius, and descended to the base of the mountain. The route was technically easy, about 1,500 feet of easy rock, followed by 1,500 feet of very elegant snow ridge, and finally 500 feet of moderately angled snow. So that's when it was first summited in 1988. So on the right hand side, coming up, is the Adair Peninsula, and whilst we can see the peninsula if you follow it from right to left, at the end of the peninsula, which we cannot see unfortunately, is where the landing spot is. There's where Borskovich came ashore. Now Borskovich came back 3 years later in 1899 and actually built 2 huts. And those 2 huts are still there. They've been completely renovated. They're Antarctic monuments, and we can actually still see them. There was a 3rd hut there, and that was from the northern party of Scott. That's Victor Campbell came up here while Scott was going to the pole, and he built a hut as well, but that's now derelict and gone. And after Victor Campbell did their work here, they were picked up by the Terra Nova and taken down to a little island called Inexpressible Island, which is just south of us, and they were there, meant to be there for 4 weeks to do some more research. And when the Terra Nova came back to pick them up, there were 8 men. Terra Nova could not get to them through sea ice, so these men had been dropped with supplies for 4 weeks. They could not be picked up and had to overwinter, spend the whole winter on this little island called Inexpressible Island. They dug a snow cave and they all survived. And at the end of the winter, before the sea ice had melted, they walked the full length of the Ross Sea on the sea ice back to McMurdo. So there are many, many phenomenal stories of survival down here that we just never hear of. And look up Victor Campbell, again an amazing explorer down here that we really haven't heard much about. And why is it called Inexpressible Island? Well, that's the name that they gave it to, because they couldn't express how bad it was. So on the left-hand side, we're just crossing the coast, pretty much exactly where we came in. We're over Berg Bay now, and you can see some of the large icebergs trapped in the sea ice below us. Looking on the left, westward along the north coast. We've got clear skies ahead of us. The pilots are I've just heard that they've just got a clearance from McMurdo Base to start climbing out of Antarctica, and we're going to start heading back to Sydney. So I hope you've got a bit of an insight into what a beautiful place this is. I get a buzz every time I come down here, and I never get sick of it. As I think I said, this is my 32nd flight of this nature. But the biggest thing for me is by bringing people down here, you get to see the magnificence of Antarctica. And once you see the magnificence of Antarctica, you become a friend of Antarctica. And the more friends Antarctica has, the greater likelihood that the Antarctic Treaty will never be broken, that we'll never have mining down here, we'll never have the military down here, we'll never have nuclear down here, and that's got to be a good thing to preserve Antarctica for the generations to come. So I'm going to say my goodbyes now and hand over to Peter. It's been wonderful to share this place, the White Continent, with you. Tell your friends. Hopefully you've had a great day, because I can tell you really have had some magnificent viewing. So here's Peter, and on behalf of me, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, that's Antarctica. We're now flying out over the sea ice, and soon we'll be climbing to head back to Sydney. And this has been a fantastic trip. We haven't really covered a huge area, but we've covered a fair bit of really interesting terrain, and I hope you all enjoyed it. And I enjoyed talking to you, and thanks for listening.
What an amazing day we've had today on our journey down to Antarctica, where we crossed the coastline and made our way down towards Mount Minto and Mount Sabine, where we did a couple of laps of those mountains, and then made our way across towards the Rennick Glacier, where we explored that region and across the coastline. And we turned around and made our way back towards Mount Minto and Mount Sabine, where the unpredictable Antarctic weather improved and we got some spectacular viewing before we turned around and made our way back to Sydney. Hope you all had a wonderful day with us today.